Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's lecture, which will be about the celebrations in Southampton between the 275th and the 375th anniversaries that had taken place in Southampton. This is going to be a lecture given by myself, Zachary Taylor, the curator and registrar at the Southampton History Museum. Just a quick plug before I officially get started for those of you who haven't done so already, following this lecture, if you would like to be part of additional lectures and programs that we have going on, be sure to go to our website at southamptonhistory.org, all one word, southamptonhistory.org, to check out any further events that we have going on following this. I believe that we have, if I'm not mistaken, we have at least one categories coming up and a couple of other interesting webinars that are going to be hosted by some of our other staff and other guests that we have enlisted so far. Trying to think, was there anything else? I'm pretty sure, yes, that'll be, of course, any further events we will have posted on our website, as well as any blog entries, deep dives, continued coronavirus journals that we will have coming through. Be sure to keep tabs on our website, and we will make sure that any sort of PR information will be reached out to you guys via email. So thank you once again for joining me in this lecture, and also being a part of our programs that we are hosting digitally, of course, with the Southampton History Museum. So anyway, I believe I can get started properly with this. So the 275th and 375th anniversaries of Southampton. The timing of this lecture is actually almost accidentally perfect because as of tomorrow, June 12th, it will be the 380th anniversary of the founding of Southampton. Observing this day, known as Founders Day, is usually reserved for every 25 years. And oh, my sound is cutting out a bit. Maybe I'm talking a little too fast. I apologize. Audio troubles have been the bane of my existence ever since we got started with these. I will try to slow down, of course. So anyway, like I was saying, observing this day, otherwise known as Founders Day, is usually reserved for every 25 years and would consist of a multitude of events and activities to honor the founding of the village, its history, and its prospects of its future. While it's impossible to adequately celebrate this year, additionally, due to the pandemic that's been unfolding for the better part of this year so far, we can absolutely look back on two distinct years in which Southampton's anniversary was observed, namely, of course, the 275th and 375th year celebrations, which will be the focus of this lecture. With a collection of photographs that we at the Southampton History Museum have amassed relating to the 275th year anniversary in 1915, as well as recalling our own events, exhibitions, and lectures that we have hosted a century later in 2015, just 5 years ago, we will observe the ways Southampton has been honored, given its history, traditions, cultures, and the people that have made these all possible. So, let's get rid of the attendees, so that's not a distraction at all. So why is this going forward? Gotta make sure this is not on autoplay. My apologies. I thought I'd be done with any sort of like technical malfunctions. Okay, are we gonna stay? Good, perfect. Keep it that way. Okay, so the 275th anniversary pageant in 1915. Southampton, as we know it, was founded in 1640 when settlers landed at Conscience Point, greeted and given safe passage inland by the local Native American tribe known as the Shinnecock. After being granted land for a village to develop, Southampton had seen a tumultuous history unfold as time has gone on, through early colonial life to the American Revolution, followed by British troops occupying and taking up quarters in the town, the Civil War alongside the rest of the country, all the way up to its continued expansion. Southampton's history is also recognized through the ownership of the Rogers Mansion, since its construction and occupation by generations of the Rogers family to the ownership under Dr. John Nugent, and finally the ownership of Samuel L. Parrish up to 1915. At this point in Southampton, a big occasion called for a big pageant, and with a big pageant requiring the extraordinary organizational and choreographic talents of one Abigail Fithian Halsey. When in 1915, the village celebrated its 275th anniversary in Agawam Park, it was an event that the likes of which the village has never seen up to this point. There were stage performances, including a colonial wedding, groups of Shinnecock members, costumed pilgrims, Union soldiers, and others, all performing for villagers, and some of whom came from afar to see such a grand spectacle celebrating Southampton's history. The modern world had been dispensed with pageants, but we have, of course, we have the George Morris photographs that had documented this undertaking to show us what had happened. Okay, so before I get started with the mentioning the 275th lecture proper, I should probably throw up a pretty sizable disclaimer coming up to this. I should state, starting this section, I should start by mentioning that throughout the 275th anniversary celebration, a rather prejudice-fueled, sorry. Water helps. During this time, a rather prejudice-fueled depiction of indigenous people occurred quite a few times during the celebration. I have no doubt that this stems from how indeed many have, and unfortunately still do, view indigenous populations. And although I would like to distance ourselves away from those notions, as they're frankly inexcusable, to say the least, they are still part of the history to the extent of finding their way into this pageant. So additionally, these depictions are by no means recalled in this lecture as a means of glorifying them, but to present an honest examination into the content of this particular pageant. It would be, this is the part where some of my text actually cuts out, I apologize. It would be much more dishonest and unprofessional to simply omit these depictions to present a sanitized and thus incorrect history of how these celebrations took place and indeed what acts were displayed. One more thing worth mentioning, as uncomfortable as this is, many of the people depicting indigenous peoples in this celebration, they themselves were Caucasian themselves, which is additionally distasteful, to say the least. With that, like I said, rather sizable warning in place, we may begin properly. So then, much of the info about the 275th anniversary was cataloged in a publication titled, and this is a rather lengthy title, so bear with me, please, The Celebration of the 275th Anniversary of the Founding of the Town of Southampton, New York, with the additional subtitle, Southampton, the First English Settlement in the State of New York, as written by what was known then as the Southampton Colonial Society. Founders Day itself falls on June the 12th, that's tomorrow, folks, with Southampton's founding in 1640, once again. So then, the town itself was founded by those emigrating from England in 1620 with the prospect of a vision for a freer life in what they saw as the New World. The 275th anniversary was designed to honor those principles that were seen as the foundations for the United States founding, as well as Southampton's incorporation, elements of which can be seen in the very festivities that took place during the celebration. It was also assembled to impress the undercurrent of freedom and liberty onto the minds of the then current generations that were living in Southampton during the early 20th century, almost to the letter. In hopes of ensuring the history of Southampton's foundation as to not be lost in time was another reason that this celebration took place. The celebration was also intended to establish a memorial of the past in the shape of a permanent loan exhibition to preserve the historical material in Southampton. The celebration itself was successful in its unity of the people of Southampton. According to the president of the Colonial Society at the time, L. Emery Terry, in this preface of the publication, The estimated total attendance and participants run up to about 1,500, adding to the success the celebration saw in volumes of people involved, which is a much more ballooning number, as we will get into later. The activities themselves took place were, in his words, purely and strictly historical, with no inconsistencies present. In his own words, the celebration was of and by the Southampton people, and the beautiful community spirit which prevailed throughout the preparation and rendition will always linger in our memory. So many committees consisting of prominent individuals and family members took part in assembling this particular pageant. Members of the Jagger, Foster, Halsey, Cooper, Hildreth, Herrick, and Post family saw their involvement as honorary committee members, names of which will be very familiar to those who have dabbled in the history of Southampton, stretching, needless to say, all the way back to its inception. Their involvement as honorary committee members within the Greater Hamptons area surrounding Southampton, with the most notable member of the reception committee, including none other than Samuel L. Parrish himself. Interestingly, one of the honorary committee members, C. Elmer Smith, was actually the mayor during this time, as well as during the time of the Spanish flu, which we've covered in our blog section on the Southampton History Museum website. And it was from complications stemming from the flu that caused him to unfortunately pass away, just to further highlight the coincidence of the timing of this lecture. So moving on to the introduction by Robert K. Atkinson, the director of the pageant itself. He states that the pageant was an attempt for the community to portray, using dramatic forms, the facts of its own history, as well as the ideals that went into its development. Through choices of great historical lore and their disposal, they were able to capture the imagination of the audience in the form of their dramatic practices and reenactments. The pageant was intended to arouse a deep appreciation of those who have gone before us, in his own words, and those who undertook the establishment of a democratic system, as well as to preserve the heritage of the past and hopes for the future. Abigail herself was the author of the pageant, of course. Herself a native of Old Southampton and student of history, herself the local history is what she gravitated towards the most. The idea of the pageant that celebrated Southampton's founding has been with her for a while leading up to this point. Her plan was presented to the committee, and with her own conviction and enthusiasm, it then became a reality. She offers her own recollection of the pageant after its execution. According to her, the pageant itself surpassed the fondest dreams of its directors and facilitators, and even herself in the long run. She remarked how the beautiful day set on Lake Agawam rendered this pageant as near perfect and as perfect as it could possibly achieve. She mentions how the community spirit itself was wondrous, full of joy and reverence, and in her own words, nothing that the people of Southampton ever did up to that point yielded such a large return. So onto the pageant itself, and at this point we now have, I can then share photographic documentation that we at the Southampton History Museum had in our archives. So we begin with some of the events, unfortunately, their photographs being lost to time, but to the best of our abilities, we will try to run through a timeline of what had taken place. We begin with a dance of the spirits of the woods and the waters that served as the prologue to the entirety of this pageant. This dance took place with dozens of participants, mostly women in elaborate gowns. This was then followed by the Southampton's beginning itself, as shown with an encampment of Shinnecock natives working within the village with another dance following, building up intensity until it comes to an abrupt halt at the site of the settlers' canoe in the harbor that we see landing here. The Puritans would then land at what was intended to be Conscience Point, where they landed in history, with the first to set on land being a woman who would exclaim the phrase, "For conscience sake, we're on dry land once more." With the leadership of Edward Howell, the settlers draw up a treaty with the Shinnecock, which led to the security of land for the English for their landing point in the North Bay to the south side of the island. signed off by a handful of Shinnecock members themselves, as the dramatization depicts. At least 20 men and their families, led by the minister Abraham Pearson, marched from the North Sea to reach their new homes at what was then known as Old Town, later becoming Southampton. We have a few more photographs that I would like to also flash up. Here we see the encounter between the Shinnecock natives encountering the settler Puritans themselves in the aftermath of the dance that the Shinnecocks had performed. This particular photo also indicating a trade that had taken place between the two factions. And here we see the depiction of John Goodale and an unidentified Shinnecock member looking over a petition at the pageant during this scene as well. And here we actually see Chief Bunn himself smoking the peace pipe during the pageant itself. He himself was a genuine member of the Shinnecock tribe. As I said at the start of this, some of the participants depicting Shinnecocks were Caucasians. Chief Bunn himself was legit. And also, it should bear mentioning the depiction of aforementioned Caucasian folks depicting the Shinnecocks, as you see in this photo here, albeit with some wear and tear on the center towards the left of the photo itself. You see a depiction of adults and children depicting Shinnecock natives. And another one of a woman depicting a Shinnecock native woman while carrying a child on her back during the pageant, as well as additional groups of women and children dressed in Shinnecock costumes. It kind of speaks for itself, I think. So, this one is also an additional crowd of colonists and natives during this pageant, where you can also see the audience in attendance in the background as all of this takes place, as the participants act out in the scene. So then, following this, there was an interlude with a colonial wedding party, which included men and women conducting a bridal pair to their new home, stopping on the village green to dance with one another. Oh wait, no, I'm getting ahead of myself. That's the interlude following this following scene. My apologies. The interlude that takes place between the scene where you see the ladies crafting a quilt. The scene that interludes that is the Dame School, which is a brief interlude taking place showing children going along a path to their schoolhouse, with the program noting that there was indeed a school before 1650 with Richard Mills as the first schoolmaster, presumably alluding to this very schoolhouse, as the scene itself is depicted in 1651. The following year, 1652, this is where this scene comes into play. At this point of the scene, transitioning to Mrs. Christopher Foster amongst her friends quilting, spinning, embroidering, and sewing, depicting with the photograph titled Quilting Party, which you see here, with an additional photo of the same scene here, albeit like pulled back to see more of the participants. At one point during the scene, a Native American breaks into the scene and scalps one Mrs. Thomas Halsey, which is documented according to this publication as the only occurrence of this kind being detailed by the program. One chief of the Montauks by the name of Wyandanch delivers the murderers responsible for this heinous act, who happened to be a Pequot natives themselves, who would then be sent to Hartford, where they were tried, convicted, and executed. An additional scene, and as you can see in the photograph here, you see the trial taking place with, you have one Puritan in stocks towards the center, and then you have a man depicting a Shinnecock native in the stocks with the head and the arms in restraint, as you can see. Oh, that's jumping ahead. My apologies. In another scene that also takes a part of the trials that took place here, there's a scene depicting Josiah Stanborough and his son Peregrine, with the child being guilty of stealing fruit from Job Sayer's garden and sentencing the father to be placed in stocks and the son to go to the whipping post. that particular photo is not within our archives, as well as just visualizing that as a graphic. You can easily picture that in your mind, I think. This interlude is where the colonial wedding party takes place, which we actually do have a few photos of, with this interlude being, like I said before, men and women conducting a bridal party, conducting a bridal pair, rather, I apologize, to their new home, stopping on the village green to dance with one another, with some of the dancing scene that you see in this photo depicting that. Oh, this one also depicts additional members of the bridal party with the carriage of the two being led to their homes, as you see. Although actually these are the actors of that scene, I am just noticing now, because you can see in the foreground, you can see the actors during the wedding party with the carriage bringing that up, with also the soldiers in the background during the parade itself. More on that will follow later on. So then, this brings us to the scene of the Revolution with the Call of the Minutemen in 1775. In a scene, an American soldier is seen riding in from Sag Harbor, bringing the news of Lexington and Concord, with the assembly of the Minutemen following. According to the text, in April 5th, 1776, the 1st Regiment of Suffolk County reported 13 companies of about 1,030 Minutemen itself. However, by 1778, oh, that's railing boats, sorry, apologies. By 1778, however, the British occupation takes place with Lord Erskine addressing old men, women, and children in the marketplace, wishing the populace to not stir up any trouble for the occupying British and ensuring they would render their stay free from unpleasantness as, in quotes, circumstances will permit. So basically, it is just a matter of obey the laws, obey the rules that we are implying onto you by way of our forced occupation onto your presence. By the winter of 1778 to 79, British soldiers were historically quartering there with a disregard of property and use of war contrived to gain the ill will of the Southampton inhabitants. People were just growing restless and tired of their presence. Rigors of the military would soften by the presence of the commander, General Erskine, who was quartered in William S. Pelletrot's house. Erskine himself would resign and return to England because of his own sympathies lying with the American people themselves. Now, moving on to the whale rally in 1855, as we see here depicted by whaling boats being set out onto the waters. This scene begins with two fishermen on the shore mending nets with a merchant and farmer appearing to discuss crops and the weather. Suddenly, a man appears on the beach waving his coat, signaling the appearance of a whale itself. The fishermen blow their horn, alerting all in their presence of the sighting, and begin to launch boats to race towards the whale for the chance to harpoon it first. Before the gold rush took place on the western side of the continent, whaling itself was regarded as a rather lucrative business in Southampton and Sag Harbor, something I touched on a previous lecture about Captain's Row early on, both before the quarantine took place and then afterwards. So, moving on to the Civil War in 1861, which is depicted in various incarnations. According to the text, the scene opens with an old man falling asleep in his chair, with his memory going back to the days of 1861 itself, where he sees his old companions in a Virginia reel. Now then, the Virginia reel itself was a dance that took place here, as is depicted in this photographed scene here, with both the men and women in dress and costumed attire to fit accordingly to that scene. With actually, you can see the old man in question in the scene. You can actually see him in the background, still on the boards of the stage, finger quotes, remnants of the whaling boats in the background right behind him as well. This is the scene where you can see him dozing off and also watching the Virginia dance reel taking place. So the old man attempts to rise up and join them, but he himself is far too exhausted to get up out of his chair. After a short interval, he sees a few of his veterans returning from war, no longer the young boys that you saw like going into march into war itself, but they return as old men themselves, such as himself, and at this point, he then rises to follow them as he feels as he belongs more with them than the young ones going to war, and indeed the younger adults taking part in the Virginia Reel. So, moving on to the Spirit of Hospitality of 1880. These particular two following major scenes themselves were not, I don't think, adequately presented as far as like their scene interactions are concerned. But you see the collection of people that had been part of these scenes following with the crowds that are gathering and the attendants that are watching. So the scene of the Spirit of Hospitality opens with two Southampton residents seen conversing about how scorching hot and dirty New York City was, yearning for a return to Southampton itself. Entering the scene is a New York City resident, I should say, who discusses the bloat of business blocks and apartment homes taking up space in the city. The New Yorker himself yearns for a real home for himself and his family, invited by the Southampton residents to find their home out here. Interestingly, one of the Southampton folks states explicitly, "We would not welcome anyone who would introduce a discordant element and who would regret any commercializing of our natural advantages." This, of course, took place before the time of the Gilded Age. An immigrant from Poland enters the scene as well, offering his own labor and strength in order to be a part of Southampton too. The immigrant ensures that they too would be good citizens, and their own children do love the flag of the United States, and as much as the residents do, and they themselves have an admiration for America upon their migration. This exchange wishes to illustrate the hospitality of Southampton in welcoming people who wish to bolster the community as well as find a home of their own. Moving on to the finale of, I'll just depict another scene. This one is a little hazy, but you also see more elaborate people dressed. This is actually during the, I believe it's very hard to tell, but this is another scene, I think, depicting one of the dance scenes that had preceded this. So I apologize for this sticking out of place, I should say. But the finale itself is known as the Spirit of Southampton, that scene, which brings us to the present in 1915. A man is visited by the Spirit of Southampton, an apparition claiming to have been there for the last 275 years, besides this restless ocean, and with them ever since the Puritans had landed at Conscience Point, presumably. Seldomly seen, this spirit tells the man that he wishes to grace their celebration with its corporeal form, stating it has observed his own failures and successes, as well as the rest of the residents in Southampton. The spirit then looks towards the future of Southampton, with a man stating another generation of children are being raised here, where the spirit instructs the man to tell them the stories of their forefathers and explains the meaning of all he tells. It's at this point in the scene where a multitude of children, at least 100, I want to say. Sorry, my PowerPoint is freezing. We see more of the attendance during the grandstand during the celebration still. I believe that this is another photo of the grandstand, the attendance. I'll go on to the Hildreth department store shortly, however. But there is, at the end of the scene is where about 100 or so children depicted then as the oncoming generation of Southampton residents who will then be cultivated and learn and ingratiated with the history and the cultures and the legacy of Southampton leading up to that point. So moving on to the parade itself. Upon recollection, the parade which followed the pageant was a rather awe-inspiring spectacle, according to the catalog. At this point, the Marshal Edward P. White would lead the way via horseback towards Monument Square, where the parade had formed. At this point, veterans of the Civil War would lead the line of the march, with the pageant characters following in respective groups, all led by the Spirit of Southampton's character itself. Decorated automobiles that were contemporary for the time would bring up the rear of this parade. And as I mentioned before, the ballooning number of attendants really did shoot up at this point because during this time, an estimated 10,000 people visited Southampton that day, with as many turned away due to grounds capacity being reached already. But the march itself went from Monument Square through Job's Lane and Main Street, down Bridgehampton Road and Elm Street to disband at Monument Square, with the assembled crowd cheering enthusiastically as each group appeared, from the wood nymphs at the beginning of the prelude of the pageant to the hundreds of children representing the future of America in their final episode, the children that would be greeted by the spirit of Southampton in that final scene. The sheer spectacle, rich colors, and elaborate costumes would not be forgotten by the many who witnessed it. Now, at this point, the reception, actually, I will first briefly talk about Hildreth's. You see here the Hildreth's department store located on Main Street at the time is elaborately decorated with American flag regalia and also with a horse and buggy carriage out front. It actually, two horse and buggies can be seen because the horse on the right-hand side is peering into the shot, as well as one of the then contemporary automobiles. Hildreth's itself was decorated during this time to draw more eyes and attention, both for the village and for itself and for the sake of the pageant. And here we actually see the founding of Southampton, seeing horseback rider William John Gray on his horse, who happened to be Katie Sickles' father. So some of the more, PowerPoint freezes for a few seconds, I apologize. With a few of the other more notable attendants being this photo here of Mercator Cooper Kendrick as a child, being led by Mrs. Robert Kendrick, his mother, and Anita Fordham, his sister, on the opposite side of Mercator here. I believe there's another, yes, there is another one. Here we actually see Mercator Cooper holding hands with his father, John, holding hands with John Goodale, as they are dressed as Puritan civilians during this time. Goodale himself brandishing what appears to be a declaration or an agreement or a treaty, as well as a sword on his hip. And here we see this quad of young ladies is Meredith Bishop, Phyllis Schrader, accidentally clicked that, Phyllis Schrader, Helen Brown, and Hazel Morris, with this photo, of course, taken on the very same day. They themselves are dressed in the regalia that I believe was one of the dance intervals that had taken place. This is the outfit that they were wearing during that scene transition. So moving on to the proper reception of the 275th. After the parade itself, Samuel Parrish invited the public to a meeting at his art museum, with an opening address being made by L. Emery Terry, the president of the Colonial Society. Afterwards, Sam Parrish himself was welcomed with a very hearty response for his generosity of hosting at his art museum. Aristus F. Post of Quogue spoke of his invitation from Southold to attend the celebration to a rather raucous laughter as he was regaling his tale of traveling out there, with Edward H. Foster, Esquire, addressing the public with information of Old Southampton, which, if left unrecorded, would have been lost, much like the celebrations that took place here at the pageant. A closing address was made by Robert S. Pelletreau, Esquire of Patchogue, regarded as a grandson of Southampton, and as his ancestors had a part in its history for years leading up to this point. The gathering wrapped up with the audience showing a deep respect for Sam Parrish, to whom all felt deeply indebted. Following this reception, into the next day, actually on the 13th, a gathering at the Presbyterian Church followed on the following day, with this point being the time when the celebration during this year had winded down, with everyone left with a sense of renewed excitement and fulfillment, as well as now finding their place within the richness of Southampton's history for decades onwards. Now then, we may now fast forward to the year 2015, where we now reach the 375th year anniversary of Southampton's founding. Rather than sticking to one sole day to celebrate the birth of Southampton, the ambition this time saw the entirety of 2015 dedicated to celebrating its history in a multitude of ways, led by the Southampton History Museum, with a large committee assisting in this process, to whom we are grateful. Exhibitions, one second. Water is your friend. Exhibitions, lectures, workshops, the Insider's View tour that we host each year, and additional events were all coordinated and planned, with honoring Southampton's history as the primary goal at the end of the year. With the benefit of being 100 years after the previously discussed celebration, new modes of celebration could take place alongside the additional accumulations of history regarding Southampton itself. This all began on March 7th with a convocation taking place at the First Presbyterian Church, the very same that was founded in 1640 alongside Southampton itself, and the very same church that was where the festivities of the 1915 pageant had wrapped up. Coming full circle, we have done so. So, the year-long exhibition could be best capped off with the year-long exhibition, if these walls could talk, probably best encapsulates the dedication that the Southampton History Museum had to honoring Founders Day, now becoming a Founders Year in the 355th anniversary. From March 7th to December 31st, this exhibition that took place in the Rogers Mansion was a recreation of two distinct styles of home interiors, primarily, to get a sense of exactly how people may have lived 200 years apart in this village. This particular exhibition was featured in a New York Times article in the Long Island Arts section. Our curator at the time, long before I had come in, Emma Ballo, I apologize, our previous curator, Emma, poured over maps, deeds, documents, and research into the history of the Rogers Mansion, culminating into this very exhibition. I lost my place somehow. Recreation of what the house must have looked like at several points throughout its existence was kept in mind, with the expansion and movement of the building starting in 1648, all the way up to its registry as the Southampton History Museum itself. This show was, of course, part of the year-long anniversary of Southampton, with a 2-year effort organized by Tom Edmonds, our executive director, alongside a committee that he had formed to ensure that this would get done. Recognizing that everyone in the museum, from staff to volunteers, wanted to know more about the Rogers Mansion and its history as a microcosm of the village of Southampton's own history. Excuse me. As the entire town celebrated, actually, let me move into the next slide so you can see two of the rooms that were depicted between 1650 and 1850. You can see the very stark contrast between not only the exterior shots as seen in the illustrations, in the blurbs on the walls, but also in the formations of the objects, the furnishings, the linen, the cloth, everything that had gone into this. You could see such a clear distinction between 2 centuries, needless to say. Once again, I lost my place. Bear with me for a second, folks. As the entire town celebrates the anniversary, the Southampton History Museum's desire was to have an exhibition that focused on the village of Southampton, and on display were maps depicting the original 40 lots that were planned in the 1640s for early settlers alongside Main Street. Additionally, there were photographs of the landing location of the settlers, known as Conscious Point, as we've gone over, north of this village, where they were greeted by members of the Shinnecock tribe who helped them build their own first homes and plant crops. Without images existing in the earliest years of Southampton, Emma wished to reserve 2 spaces into the gallery, as you see here, showing what the houses may have looked like in both 1650 and 1850, based on archival materials that we had found. She even states that descendants of the most prominent Southampton families helped in supplying interviews, additional materials, in order to build the exhibition around and further facilitate the information that went into it. The 1650 quarters consists of rather heavy cooking implements and lobster claws, typical of that period, with the 1850 section showing a parlor with elaborate decorations, whaling souvenirs, and various treasures that the captains had brought back during their travels. An insurance document discovered during the exhibition's creation showed that Captain Albert Rogers, at one point or another, used part of the house as a tavern, with an even bigger surprise taking place only 2 weeks before the opening of this exhibition, which saw a prescription pad used by Dr. Nugent discovered in the floorboards during reconstruction, alongside rounded spectacles, a cigar, a human skull, a real human skull too, which we still have, medical instruments and vials that were otherwise hidden for the better part of a century, long after he had sold the house to Samuel Parrish in 1899. While the home was owned by Samuel Parrish, his own presence is shown in a hallway lined with furniture and artifacts, and a parlor room transformed into a 1920s music room based on the museum's inventory. Here you can actually see some of the shots of on the left. You see where Samuel Parrish himself. Sorry, thought a notification was from a coworker for a second. Actually, the scene on the left depicts Dr. Nugent's working space, easily illustrated by the skull that you see on the top of the desk here, which was found under the floorboards with the rest of his belongings. On the right-hand side, you see actually the main hall going into the Rogers Mansion. Goodness, it's been so long since I've been there, honestly, ever since this quarantine hit. The way that it was furnished at the time was to best replicate the same way that it does nowadays, best replicate when the mansion itself was owned by Samuel Parrish himself. Now then, onto the tours that we were hosting at the time, celebrating the 375th anniversary. This brings us to the most prominent one, the Southampton Insider's View 375th, the 6th annual Southampton House Tour. This was an opportunity to experience the extraordinary houses that show Southampton's unique architectural history, which happened on this day, with houses from the colonial days to the present, followed by a champagne reception hosted by St. Ambrose Restaurant afterwards. This tour itself took place on May the 30th. The properties that were toured include the Windmill, the Tuscan Villa, the Village Cottage, Hill House, the Lake House, a Butler's Manor, literally titled A Butler's Manor, and St. Andrew's Dune Church. All were available to the public to tour around to get a sense of the architectural history that Southampton was the home to, and is the home to, still to this day, I should say. So, moving on to May. My mistake. This should be after this tour in particular, which is the tour of Southampton's houses of worship. Sorry, I misorganized a couple of my slides, it appears. On Sunday, May the 3rd, between 1 and 4 p.m., a tour of 12 churches throughout. Oh, I don't know why I wrote 12. It actually is 11 churches. My apologies. Oh, goodness. A tour of 11 churches throughout Southampton was planned as sponsored by the Rogers Memorial Library. Additionally, the churches include the Dune Church, St. Andrew's, the Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary Basilica, the Chadbad of Southampton, the Shinnecock Presbyterian Church, the Greek Orthodox Church of the Hamptons, King's Chapel Church of God in Christ, Our Lady of Poland Roman Catholic Church, the Community Baptist Church, the First Baptist Church, the Christian Science Church, the St. John's Episcopal Church, and the First Presbyterian Church once again. Now, on to June 13th, which was the Conscience Point Rededication and Shinnecock Pageant. This particular event honored both the 1640 landing of the English and Conscience Point, as well as the 10,000 years of cultural history this landmark had also contained. Acknowledgement of its past between the Paleo-Indian and the Shinnecock periods were observed, as well as its further development as the site of the North Sea Maritime Center. An open house of the new shellfish hatchery also took place after this as well. Just waiting for PowerPoint to move. This is what happens when you're connecting to PowerPoint through a remote desktop because I don't have a licensed copy. That's what the work account is for. Little inside baseball there. So June 13th, the Conscience Point Rededication and Shinnecock Pageant. This took place. This event honored both the 1640 landing of the English. Oh wait, no, what? Sorry. Getting a little scrambled. My apologies, folks. The July 5th Halsey House Gala, as we see the advertisement for such here. This starting in 2000, the Halsey House Gala was organized by volunteers to celebrate the completion of the refurbishment of the Halsey House itself. This celebration usually takes place during the summer seasons, and this year in particular was no different, albeit with the celebration of Southampton's founding as well being a main focus of this gala. Live music, open bar, and a silent auction all took place here for all those who attended, and costumed reenactors dressed as colonial militia giving off period gun salutes were also included as the celebration unfolded. We move on now to a handful of a few tours that had taken place. Additionally, specific dates I was not able to find in our records, our public relations, etc. So then, this one is the director's tour of the Shinnecock Museum, which was directed by the museum director / curator at the time, David Bunn Martin, leading a tour of the museum established initially in 2001. This was dedicated to honoring the living history of the Shinnecock Nation, featuring the Wilcoon Village outdoor exhibit that was available during this time, with the following tour being the behind the scenes at the Sag Harbor Whaling Museum tour, with the collections manager, Richard Doctorow, being the one who hosted this, whose extensive research of the Sag Harbor whaling fleet had resulted in an extraordinarily valuable record of whaling's role in Sag Harbor's history. He leads a tour of the museum housed in the 1845 Greek Revival Mansion, as you see depicted here, built by a scion of a family of wealthy whale ship owners, is where this building had come from. We move on to a handful of brief lectures that also had taken place, a selection of many that were indeed either planned or had executed. The first one being a lecture in January 22nd by our own, once again, Tom Edmonds, which is titled A Brief History of North Sea, with his talk covering the cultural changes that took place in Southampton during the 17th century and the development of the colonial port town known as Feversham, which is now known as North Sea, whose prior history had been lost until up to this point. In May 14th, the Shinnecock Indians, America's First Whalers lecture was given by John Strong, which illustrates that before whaling became a massive industry in America, the Shinnecock tribes had developed various methods of hunting whales, with these involving teams of men in canoes who ventured out into the coastal waters to go and hunt the whales themselves, using methods that would then be adopted by those who would take part in the whaling industry that had blossomed throughout the 19th century until the gold rush that took place out west on the continent had caused, with a multitude of other reasons, caused the whaling industry at least to peter out. In June 14th, the recreation of the historic 1640 walk from Conscience Point in North Sea to Southampton Village had taken place. This was sponsored by the Southampton Trails Preservation Society to celebrate Southampton's 375th anniversary, of course. This walk simulated the 1640 walk when the Shinnecock tribe guided the English pioneers to a more habitable wintering area known as Old Town in Southampton Village, which is now Southampton Village. Additional hikes planned by the Southampton Trails Preservation Society also followed this throughout 2015. Guided tours that were equal parts tours / lectures to illustrate the history of this historic walk itself. And finally, in this section, we have House of the Hamptons, a postcards from the Gilded Age talk. A century ago, as according to the blurb advertising this lecture, a century ago, postcards were made of almost eerie homes that could be photographed between Westhampton and Montauk, with the inclusion of the legendary mansions of the Gilded Age. The architect Gary Lawrence, the co-author with Anne Searchin of Houses of the Hamptons 1880 to 1930, had discussed the ways in which these postcards served the purpose of homeowners and their value to historians and collectors today. PowerPoint is in no hurry today, apparently. The final event, wrapping up the year 2015 of celebrating the 375th anniversary of Southampton, is the anniversary party at the Rogers Mansion. All of Southampton, according to the release, All of the Southampton seniors were welcome to join us in celebrating the pleasures of the holiday season. The festivities had taken place at the Captain Albert Rogers Mansion, built in 1843, of course, himself a successful whaler. The Greek Revival Mansion was filled to the brim with holiday cheer and decor, with piano players playing traditional holiday songs in the music room on a baby grandstand piano. Poor timing for my hiccups, I apologize. The parlors and sitting rooms will be festooned with garlands of fresh winter greens and flowers, as they were, as we usually do each holiday season. Colorful antique holiday decorations were seen on the many trees that decorated the many reception rooms of the mansion, with refreshments and hors d'oeuvres being served. Sorry, I just some of my notes were out of order at the end. I thought I had more after this page. So after covering all of that, we bring ourselves to the conclusion of this lecture. Come on, PowerPoint, last slide, you can do it. There we go. So throughout the curatorial developments and the unearthing of additional history of Southampton, 100 years has made all of the difference when it comes to how we honor and celebrate Southampton. Much of the subjects and elements of Southampton that have been honored over a century ago continue to be recognized to this day, to its founding, to the whaling industry captains, to the Rogers Mansion and the occupants within, to how the Rogers Mansion itself is so integral into the history of Southampton, to the architecture that had burgeoned throughout the time, and so on and so forth. The addition of historic and cultural developments and documentations that had been either overlooked or unearthed closer to the present can only bolster the richness of this village and its surrounding towns, and indeed the history that we can discuss regarding all of this. I have no doubt that additional materials will be uncovered and presented once the next major celebration of Southampton takes place in the future, as should be the case. And with that being said, I hope to see so many people that we had seen, not only just attending these virtual lectures, but also before this pandemic really hit. I really hope to see a lot of you once more when we have these celebrations once again, because I myself am looking forward to them. I usually find them very fun. We look back on both of these events and how the celebration of Southampton has evolved between these 2 years, and begin to wonder how best we can honor Southampton's 400th year anniversary once 2040 rolls around. And it will be fascinating to see what the possibilities will be. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me for this lecture today. I will be turning over to any questions in our Q&A section that we have. Fortunately, I can't do so without closing out the PowerPoints. Okay, so we have one so far. I can hear you, but the sound is low. I apologize, Geneva. My audio setup is not ideal, considering I am actually connecting my audio through the phone line, which is infinitely better quality than the built-in microphone that I have in my my home computer. Itself is just very shaky, but even then, connecting to the phone, it's either a combination of my reception, or indeed sometimes, I will fully admit, I talk a little too fast sometimes, depending on my passion of a subject, or indeed how much I'm trying to say. So that probably will explain why my audio is a little faulty at times, and I apologize for that. So far, no other questions have come in. Lots of info. Thank you for sharing, Leanna. Thank you very much. I greatly appreciate that. Poring all over all of this material was so fascinating, not only unearthing so much more information about Southampton than everything that I had learned up to this point. I had known about a pageant that had taken place in 1915 a little bit before really doing this this lecture, but once I found not only just the photos, but also the compendium catalog that I unearthed, which I believe we have in our archives, but the copy that I have was easily distributed by Google Books itself. Public domain is a beautiful thing for that reason. Yeah, it was very fascinating being able to go through this and seeing the practice of how exactly they celebrated then, and also comparing that to how we celebrate nowadays, the very founding of Southampton. I I very easily have a bias for how we do it nowadays. Call that the cult of the new, if you wish, but well, at the same time, I wasn't even part of the museum in 2015. Not until last year I was on board, but from then up to this point, it's been very fascinating learning about all of this. And it's always really wonderful being able to look at these sort of things and think about how exactly can we curate an exhibition or a gallery or an entire historic mansion surrounding all of this information, which through Roger's Mansion has been doing fantastically in all of the exhibitions that we've had thus far. Just wait a couple of minutes. Oh, another one. I wonder why the United Methodist Church was not included in the church tours. Was it not? I want to backtrack. Let me. Boy, even minimized PowerPoint is really not cooperative. United Methodist Church. Yeah, no, it's not on there. Yeah, that's fascinating. I myself have no explanation as to why that would have been the case. I'm not sure if it was the availability of the churches in the house of worship at the time, or indeed exactly how many churches can we, how many can we visit during the span of a 3-hour tour of Southampton houses of worship. But that's a very interesting omission. I unfortunately don't have an answer as to why that was the case. Unfortunately, my apologies, Lynn. Let's see, a few more minutes for additional questions if they might come in. I got to admit, I was initially planning on this lecture being about 30 to 45 minutes, but the wealth of information that I found that condensing it simply to 30 to 45 minutes, I'm running up to about an hour and change now. I don't feel like that could have done it justice. I had to go a little bit further than that. Although that being said, considering what I was able to find in our records and documentations, it would have been interesting to glean a little bit more about info about the lectures and the tours that I had found. What I really wanted to do was like illustrate really like how these celebrations were executed, and indeed what methods that they used. With the focus of the materials, I was fearful of that taking away from the grander scale of exactly what this lecture was. I should actually point out that I wanted to include them in this lecture, but firstly, I don't trust PowerPoint. Well, period, after today. Second of all, I don't trust PowerPoint when it comes to showing video footage, which I have had a terrible history trying to get that to work, all the way back to my years of undergrad at Stony Brook University, through graduate school to the present. Almost every single time I've had issues with video, and I didn't want to chew up any more time that I already had done so between the wealth of material that I brought, as well as some of the audio snafus and me stumbling over myself, to be perfectly honest. But the two videos that I have in our archives, in our collections, one of which is of the 1915 pageant itself, about 7 or 8 minutes of footage spliced together, presented by the British Path, which surprisingly is not on their YouTube channel. Like, you usually expect them to upload that sort of stuff onto their YouTube channel, but I guess they had no love for their sister city in America, considering their. No, I'm just kidding, of course. Really, I have no idea as to why that footage wasn't on there. I saw it was hosted on, I think one of the channels was on like a Daily Motion video or something like that. But yeah, between that and another video that our own Connor Flanagan which I am not. I am actually Zachary Taylor. I just realized that whole time Connor's name was there. I thought I had fixed that when I logged in yesterday, but I guess it resets every single time I log in. My apologies for that. I didn't mean to cause that confusion. But anyway, the other video that we have was shown to me by our own Connor Flanagan of some of the celebration parade that had taken place in 2015, which shows him actually being part of that activity. And between those two videos, I would love to get them uploaded onto our YouTube channel. And considering the 12th is tomorrow, folks, I think it would be absolutely perfect if I could get those posted on our channel and uploaded to our blog so y'all can see them for yourselves, because I think they're beautiful. There's no audio, with the British Path 1915 footage. So once again, having like just a silent video would be rather jarring during a lecture. But I think having those two available, I think that would be for the best. No other questions coming in. I guess that's it, everybody. Like I said, thank you so much, every single one of you, for coming in today. This is really an adventure for me. Not only giving this lecture and all the material that was involved, but also being on hosting duties and having to broadcast this myself to all of you, making sure I had all of my ducks in a row that way. I'm glad that, as it appears right now, everything had gone through successfully. And with the end of this broadcast, we will have this uploaded and edited to our liking for time-wise and everything, to remove dead air, things like that in the beginning, of course, because I think there was some confusion when I was trying to figure out if people were coming in, how the audio was doing, blah, blah, blah. After all that's taken care of, we're going to get this uploaded. And once again, thank you so much, everybody who signed up today. I hope to see all of y'all in the future with our virtual tours, our gatherings, our events, and everything we're doing electronically through social media. And I will see all of you on down the line. And once this is all said and done, it'll be very, very great to see all of you once again in person. Thank you so much. This is Zachary Taylor. Have a wonderful day. Okay, now for the final test, how do I stop recording?